Behind the iron bars of prison, some of the world's most notorious killers found a justice far more brutal than any courtroom could deliver. These men spent years stalking, killing, and evading the law. But within those prison walls, there was no escaping the consequences of their crimes. We'll explore 5 infamous serial killers who thought they were untouchable, until prison gave them a deadly dose of their own medicine. Angels. They're supposed to bring protection, love, and hope. But not this angel. Donald Harvey, aka the Angel of Death, was pretty much the opposite. He preyed on the weak, taking lives with chilling ease. For nearly 2 decades, Harvey, a hospital orderly, secretly killed patients in his care. At first, he called them mercy killings, claiming he was easing the suffering of the terminally ill. But over time, the mask slipped, and Harvey revealed his true self. He took pleasure in watching his patients die, feeding off the control he had over their fates. Officially tied to 37 murders, he later claimed the number was closer to 87. Meticulous and cold, Harvey believed himself untouchable until 1987, when his killing spree finally came to an end. He was sentenced to 28 life terms after pleading guilty in order to avoid the death penalty. Fast forward to 2017, at Toledo Correctional Institution, the tables turn. James Elliott, a fellow inmate, had been planning Harvey's end for over a week. Elliott wasn't driven solely by personal hatred for Harvey, though that played a role. His frustration was also directed at the prison system, angry at guards and officials who ignored his complaints about the poor quality of food. Killing another inmate, especially one as notorious as the Angel of Death, was Elliott's way of forcing them to take notice. In an interview with prosecutor Drew Wood, Elliott admitted that the murder was partly about getting attention, but beyond that, he saw Harvey as the perfect target for his own twisted sense of justice, a way to balance the karmic scales, and an opportunity to do something constructive in an attempt to seek redemption for his own past crimes. For days, Elliott observed Harvey, waiting for the right moment. On March 28, 2017, he struck, ambushing Harvey in his cell. Armed with a makeshift shank, when Harvey resisted, Elliott changed tactics, opting for a more brutal method. The attack left Harvey with skull fractures, broken ribs, and severe internal injuries. For 2 days, Harvey clung to life, powerless. The man who had taken pleasure in controlling others' fates was now the helpless victim. On March 30th, 2017, he died from his injuries. And so, Donald Harvey, who had spent his life deciding the fates of others, met his own end with no control at all. I don't know how you remember the Pied Piper, but I always thought it had something to do with rats and a magic flute. Well, let me tell you, the Pied Piper of Tucson, his story is nothing like that, and it's definitely not a fairy tale. Charles Schmid, in the 1960s, was a master manipulator who captivated teenagers in Tucson with his flashy clothes and Elvis-like charisma. He wore makeup to hide his acne scars and even stuffed his boots to appear taller. But beneath the surface, Schmid was a cold-blooded killer. Over a few years, Schmid murdered 3 young women, Aline Rowe and sisters Gretchen and Wendy Fritz. And here's the unbelievable part. He actually bragged about it to his friends, convinced he'd never be caught. That cocky attitude, it was his downfall. Eventually, his so-called friends couldn't keep his deadly secret. Schmid was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death, later reduced to life in prison. And while behind bars, Schmid tried to escape more than once, but none of his attempts were as ridiculous as the one in 1972. Picture this. Schmid escapes from prison, thinking a bright yellow wig is the perfect disguise. He even darkened his skin with makeup, but a railroad worker who happened to know him from school immediately recognized him. Schmid was quickly caught, ending his escape in total humiliation. Back in prison, Schmid's reputation was in ruins, but his real nightmare was coming. For weeks, fellow inmates had been quietly planning his murder. Why? We'll never know for sure. Whether it was revenge, hate, or just prison politics, they never said a word. Unlike Schmid, who loved to boast, they waited silently. Then, on March 10th, 1975, they struck. Inside those prison walls, there's no place to hide. In the shadows of the cell block, Schmid was attacked, stabbed 47 times. Yeah, 47 stab wounds to his face and chest. The once confident and feared Schmid was left bleeding out and utterly powerless. And the crazy part? He didn't die right away. Schmid clung to life for 10 agonizing days in the prison hospital before finally succumbing to his injuries on March 30th. The Pied Piper of Tucson, who had lured others to their deaths, was forced to linger painfully on his own. You might know Albert DeSalvo as the Boston Strangler, the man behind 13 brutal murders in the early 60s. Between 1962 and 1964, 13 women were found strangled in their homes. DeSalvo, smooth-talking his way into their apartments, confessed to it all. Though, fun fact, some still debate whether he was the real killer or just taking the blame. Either way, his name became a synonym for fear. But get this, he wasn't caught for those murders. Nope, it was a bunch of robberies that put him behind bars. Classic mix-up. Once in custody, he fessed up to being the Strangler and landed a life sentence at Walpole State Prison, one of the toughest out there. You'd think after all that, DeSalvo would lie low, right? Stay out of trouble? Not a chance. Rumor has it, DeSalvo got tangled in the prison's drug trade, and not just a little bit. He started stepping on some major toes. These weren't petty crooks either. We're talking about a syndicate run by inmates who didn't play nice. DeSalvo? He became their next target. And then in 1973, they finally struck. On a cold November morning, Albert DeSalvo was found dead in his cell, stabbed viciously over and over again. He'd been left to bleed out for nearly 10 hours before anyone found him. The irony? The Boston Strangler, who had once taken lives by squeezing the breath out of his victims, met his own end slowly and violently, this time at the hands of someone else, with no way to fight back. A member of the Winter Hill Gang, Robert Wilson, was even tried for the murder. But here's the kicker. He walked free after a hung jury. So officially, DeSalvo's murder remains unsolved. But those who were there? They'll tell you it was payback for messing with the prison's drug trade. The Boston Strangler, once the terror of a city, couldn't save himself from a fate he'd never imagined. In the end, the hunter became the hunted. Since strangling seemed to be in vogue among serial killers in the 60s, here's another one for you. Lee Roy Martin, better known as the Gaffney Strangler, who terrorized South Carolina in 1968. Martin strangled 4 women in a series of brutal murders, leaving the town of Gaffney paralyzed with fear. But Martin? He was as arrogant as they come. He didn't just murder, he taunted the police, calling local newspapers and giving them directions to where the bodies were hidden. You heard that right. He played games with the cops, thinking he was untouchable. Like many killers, though, his ego was his downfall. Martin kept a detailed diary of his crimes, and when his wife found it, she didn't waste any time. She turned him in, and his own words seal his fate. He was arrested, convicted, and slapped with 4 consecutive life sentences. In prison, his reputation followed him, and grudges ran deep. On May 31st, 1972, at the Central Correctional Institution, Martin met his brutal end. Death from behind. Fitting, isn't it? The man who took lives from the shadows was stabbed from behind himself. Kenneth Rumsey, another inmate, approached Martin in the prison workshop. Armed with a homemade shank, Rumsey didn't need weeks of plotting or dramatic revenge speeches. He seized his moment and struck, stabbing Martin repeatedly. The Gaffney Strangler, the man who once thought he had the upper hand, never saw it coming. As for Rumsey's motive, maybe it was disgust for Martin's crimes, maybe something else. But prison is a powder keg. The smallest spark can set it off, and in Martin's case, that spark was enough to take him out for good. Last on our list is Whitey Bulger. Now, Bulger wasn't your typical serial killer, but don't let that fool you. He was as deadly as they come. He ran Boston's infamous Winter Hill Gang, a name that should sound familiar by now. And as you've likely gathered, they didn't earn their reputation through a gentle approach. From the 1970s to the 90s, Bulger was Boston's crime kingpin. Drugs, extortion, murder. He had a hand in every dark corner of the city. And while ruling the streets, Bulger was also working with the FBI, using them to take out his rivals. Talk about playing both sides. But in 1994, his luck ran out, and he went on the run, dodging capture for almost 17 years. He wasn't just laying low either. He became one of the FBI's 10 most wanted, second only to Osama bin Laden. That's the kind of company he kept. Eventually, in 2011, the law caught up with him. By then, Bulger was 81 years old, living quietly in Santa Monica, California, with his longtime girlfriend. When authorities finally dragged him into court, the once feared mob boss was sentenced to 2 life terms. And if you think the old-timer was about to enjoy a peaceful retirement behind bars, you'd be dead wrong. He was shuffled around various federal prisons for years, just another old man in the system. But despite his age, he was never off anyone's radar. Fast forward to October 30th, 2018. Bulger had just been transferred to Hazleton Federal Prison in West Virginia, and this move didn't go unnoticed. Just hours after arriving, a couple of inmates with long-standing grudges saw their chance, and they didn't just rough him up. Armed with padlocks stuffed in socks, they beat him so viciously that Bulger was left unrecognizable. The once dreaded mob boss who had ruled with fear now met a death as brutal as any hit he'd ever ordered. The mastermind? Fotios Freddy Gayas, a mafia hitman with a personal vendetta. This wasn't a random prison fight. It was a carefully orchestrated execution. For the families of Bulger's victims, his death brought a strange sense of closure. Stephen Davis, whose sister was one of Bulger's alleged victims, said it best. "He died the way I always hoped he would die." If you're still watching, I'm sure I've got plenty more videos you'll love. Strangle that subscribe button and dive into more exciting stories.